Hello and welcome to a Conquest, the last argument of Kings unit, tier list, and faction focus and review for the Sorcerer Kings. In this video, we'll be talking about who the Sorcerer Kings are, how they play, what is their strengths, weaknesses, and faction identity, before jumping into a tier list format, because the internet loves tier list formats, as a vehicle to discuss all of the individual units in the factions, and yes, give them a ranking from the classic S to D in terms of how they fit within the faction. Just as a quick reminder for those who haven't seen this kind of video before, how we are going to be ranking units in this video from S to D is how they fit within the internal balance and construction of the faction. We won't be making significant cross-faction comparisons. Instead, a unit, for example, will be considered to be S tier if it dominates list construction within the faction to the point of excluding other options. An S tier unit might be overpowered or undercosted, or in the case of Sorcerer Kings, perhaps do something that is just necessary and extremely powerful and can't be duplicated in other ways. An A tier faction is the kind of good and pleasant version of an S tier, where it is powerful, where it is a core faction strength to have access to a unit or a character like this, where these kind of units are commonly taken, but not necessarily to the total exclusion of other units in the faction. An example of an A tier unit is something like Raiders in Nords, where they aren't an overpowered regiment, but the things they do are core to Nord identity. B tier units are supplementary, often doing something unique or filling a valuable niche, but not necessarily being powerful or dominant. And in an ideal world, a faction has quite a lot of B tier units that are taken in a kind of mix and match fashion. C tier units are units that are weaker or harder to use, but probably viable. These can be vanity picks or hear me out kind of picks, but which do still have a place in certain lists under certain circumstances, even if perhaps they are outperformed in terms of power by other things within the faction. Finally, D tier units are those that just kind of fall below viable use. Most units in Conquest do have some kind of an interesting concept behind them narratively, but when a unit is in D tier, it's usually because the rules don't deliver or because there is just some failure to function in the rules as currently written. A D tier unit is often only a few design iterations away from reaching a higher tier, but there are still some in the game, although they are rare. The Mimetic Assassin Inspires is an example of a D tier unit where its rules just don't really deliver on the fantasy in any way. Now, before we jump into an overview of Sorcerer Kings as a faction, just the usual disclaimer and reminder that we're using the tier list here just as a vehicle for discussion and conversation. Tier lists are kind of designed to start arguments, and the actual point here is, firstly, discussion, and secondly, just to give us a vehicle to talk through the factions. Really, this is a faction-focused style video, using a tier list as that kind of mechanism. With that disclaimer out of the way, let's talk Sorcerer Kings. Now, at their core, Sorcerer Kings are, as you would absolutely expect from the name, an extremely powerfully magical faction. These are great and powerful wizards leading armies of conjured elementals and gifted mortals, and that finds itself expressed through a lot of mechanics in the army, but the most important ones are the rituals. Rituals are powerful and specialized works of magic that take time to build up, and mechanically how that works is that spellcasters in your army, they don't have to be on the battlefield yet, can start preparing rituals, and those rituals will build up over time. They'll be fueled by the activations of your elementals and your spellcasting characters, and once complete, they actually become a card that can be placed in your command stack on your next turn. Now, rituals do vary in power, but as a mechanic, they are extremely powerful. The most powerful ritual effects let you heal your entire army, let you reorder your command stack, let you damage enemy units anywhere on the battlefield, ignoring usual targeting range restrictions, and even perform triple action activations, which is a very, very powerful mechanic that is otherwise extremely gated in terms of access to the rest of the game. Only Sorcerer Kings have regular turn after turn access to unfettered, unrestricted triple action activations. Now, in general, you're only going to get one, sometimes two of these around, because the rituals that allow it can each only be played once per turn. So the only way to get two triple action activations in a turn is to have the last activation of a previous turn set up a triple activation at the beginning of your coming turn, and then play that same ritual again in the turn that you're playing little bit of complexity there, and we'll see that as a theme. But even having one regiment every round be able to take 3 actions, and that's available to the air and fire courts, which we'll talk through, is very powerful. The other effects are all very strong as well, and what that means is that Sorcerer Kings are a very powerfully magical faction, able to pull off and create effects that other factions really can't replicate. Now, their magic isn't restricted just to rituals either. Almost all of the characters, generally speaking, all of the characters you will actually take, are powerful wizards. These are all Wizard 7 and Wizard 8 characters, and you will usually have 3 or even 4 of them in a list, which means you are casting just tons of spells from a highly versatile set of spell lists. Unlike other factions, where you will generally expect a wizard to know maybe 2 or 3 or perhaps even 4 spells, every Sorcerer King's character knows all of the spells associated with their court, and that is 6 spells per court. Now, in terms of focus, you can expect that, a Dwegom fire sorcerer, their dangerous and damaging fire spells will be a bit more powerful than the damaging fire spells of the Sorcerer Kings, even of the Fire Court. But where Dwegom, for example, are specialized, Sorcerer Kings are versatile. 6 spells, most of which are good and interesting and do different things per spellcaster, means that on any given turn you just have so many different options that you can use. Almost every wizard in Sorcerer Kings, and again, you'll have lots of wizards in Sorcerer Kings, at any given time will be able to choose between a selection of different buffs and debuffs and offensive spells as they need, which means that you are just swimming in magic in this faction. That magic in turn then tends to trigger extra effects, and your elementals, which will be the bulk of your force in most Sorcerer King's armies. There are gifted mortals, but the gifted mortals usually will be supplementary to these powerful summoned and conjured elementals. The elementals will have bonuses that then in turn trigger from meeting certain conditions, which can be keyed to terrain, battlefield conditions, rituals, and spells to produce even more power. Now, if all of that sounds like it might be a little bit complicated, this is where we begin to hit the limitations of Sorcerer Kings. It is very easy to look at all of the different things that are available to Sorcerer Kings and make an on-paper assessment of the high watermark of their power and conclude that this has to be the most powerful faction in the game. And while that actually to an extent is true, reaching that high watermark, particularly where we look at the synergies that can occur between the courts, where, for example, we might have an air court spell being used to boost a fire court ranged unit, that comes with compromise. There is also just a great deal of work to be done setting up and executing a Sorcerer King's game plan or even just a Sorcerer King's turn, which add little mechanical complexities and obstacles and compromises that make reaching that absolute high watermark of power non-trivial under any circumstance. And this is something that I have seen borne out in play even from the best Sorcerer Kings player. Just as a quick note, and to give some thanks, a lot of the content for this video was provided by a good friend of mine, Ewan from Western Australia. Ewan has been playing Sorcerer Kings since inception, since they were released. He is an exceptional Conquest player generally, and I would be willing to bet a small amount of money that there is a solid likelihood that he is in fact the best Sorcerer Kings player in the world, and even he runs into the limitations posed by the need to set up and then execute the most powerful mechanical combinations available in Sorcerer Kings. The apex of power in Sorcerer Kings, the on-paper assessment of the power of Sorcerer Kings, only very occasionally manifests, kind of in comparison, for example, to what might be the other most powerful faction in the game right now, Euroni, whose mechanical strength derives from just good attributes and stats, and mechanical flexibility that is easier to execute. Sorcerer Kings have that complexity baked into them, where you need to build up and then execute your rituals. You need to time your rituals with your elemental activations. You need to trigger all of the conditions for your elementals to reach their peak of power. And while you are doing all of that, a competent opponent will be doing their best to disrupt and predict you. And that means that while Sorcerer Kings are extremely powerful, you will generally, in practice, see them operating more at like 80 or 90% of theoretical maximum strength than they're necessarily on paper 100% maximum strength. A few other things that are worth noting in terms of limitations that the Sorcerer Kings face. When you are building lists, you are generally going to have to pick a single elemental court out of 4 and maybe include only a small contingent of secondary models. There are some elementals, for example, that splash into a list easily. They are water elementals, which we are waiting on release at the moment. But usually as a Sorcerer Kings player, any individual army will be focused on just a single court. And as you might expect from this lengthy discussion around setting up and executing with the faction, they're a faction that develops their board and their play a little bit more slowly, particularly more slow than some of the fastest armies in the game. One of the things that is notably absent from Sorcerer Kings is any way to make a light regiment count as if it has scoring stands. This means that Sorcerer Kings take time to spin up. They need to get their units onto the board to start fully activating their rituals, and they don't start hitting the apex of their strength until turns like 4, for example. Now, turn 4 is still plenty early in the game, and you will have rituals in your deck very occasionally on turn 2, but more often you'll start playing your first rituals realistically on turn 3. They'll start having an effect on the game on turn 3. And that isn't out of line with when most other factions start being able to do things like make volleys and make clashes, but it's just a touch slower than the fastest armies, which means armies that develop very quickly and are on the board very quickly and are pushing on you very quickly. Sorcerer Kings, not only will they have a scoring disadvantage against those armies, but they will need to kind of fight a rearguard or a holding action until everything is ready and they have their own big surge of strength to respond. Now, I have seen that pattern of play happen many times. If you over-aggress into a Sorcerer King's army and you can't push them back and contain them and deal damage, by the time their rituals come online on turns like turn 3 and turn 4, the counter-strike will be devastating. But it is nevertheless that early part of the game is a window in which a Sorcerer King's player usually has to be at least a little bit more passive, which means they have to score slightly fewer scenario points during turn 2 and sometimes turn 3, which can give players just an edge that can matter by the time the game is decided. Overall, though, Sorcerer Kings, while complicated, are a faction that rewards setup and execution, that rewards mechanically understanding what they're capable of, and then ordering and bringing those mechanics together to bring the army fully online and reach its height of power. And that height of power, those spikes of strength are so strong. The effects of the rituals, triple activations, the speed and striking distance and striking power, even of small elemental units, is just a sight to behold and thoroughly fearsome. Now, before we get into the tier list proper, since we've spent so much time talking about the elemental courts, and because any given Sorcerer King's list is likely to be heavily focused on one of these courts, but we aren't going to be putting them in the tier list, just a quick primer about how each of these courts tends to play. Right now, comfortably, the Court of Fire is the most powerful. Most competition Sorcerer Kings lists are primarily Court of Fire, with perhaps some additional units or some additional spellcasters to have access to some of the utility options from other courts. And many of the most powerful things you'll hear me talking about when we get to units come from interactions that the Court of Fire enables. The Court of Fire, just at large, has high damage, powerful healing, and extreme threat ranges, and those 3 things are sufficient to win many games of Conquest. In terms of their special mechanics, most of their elementals will have some special rule that triggers off of the inflamed condition. Inflamed can be triggered both on your fire elementals and on enemy units, and this is triggered by rituals and spells. Usually, not always, but usually, it is very easy for the Court of Fire to get inflamed wherever they need it, but it is worth noting that that is just a almost always. Very occasionally, in some lists, you will see inflamed not able to be triggered at exactly the right moment, or perhaps requiring an activation before a unit can fully benefit from it. And that's where we start to see that example of how the 100% on paper power assessment of Sorcerer Kings seems extreme, but in practice they are only hitting 80 or 90% most of the time. If you have an army with a swath of Efreet Flamecasters, a lot of the time, they'll be fully benefiting from the inflamed keyword. But some of the time, maybe one of them won't, and that is just worth considering when we think about the overall power and balance of the faction. There are a lot of other powerful things in Court of Fire, but their rituals are particularly worth noting, with Conflagration and Fiery Dominion being the 2 rituals that you will use most. Conflagration has an effect where it inflicts hits on enemy inflamed regiments, which you will sometimes see in play, but in practice the main purpose of Conflagration is to allow for the triple activation, since an elemental activating after Conflagration, if they're a fire elemental, gets the 3 action activation, and Fiery Dominion has a couple effects, but the primary one is that all regiments with the Fire Elemental special rule heal 4 wounds and become inflamed. Now, the fact that some armies, in fact most Court of Fire armies, will be built in a way that allows them to have 2 or even 3 rituals in a turn, can use multiple Fiery Dominions. Conflagration is limited to 1, but Fiery Dominion is not, allows for just a colossal amount of sustain through chip damage, which means that even though elementals generally, and Court of Fire elementals as well, they don't have particularly high resilience. They are 5 wounds, defense 3, resolve 3, usually taken in units of 3. It's 15 wounds with average defense stats. That will go down to a sufficiently dedicated attack, but if you are trying to weather down a Court of Fire army through chip damage, maybe firing at them with long range, things like marksman clones or longbowmen or offensive spellcasting, Court of Fire will just almost completely ignore the entirety of that because of their ability to just sustain thanks to Fiery Dominion. It's probably the most powerful ritual, and given that it is competing with triple action activation rituals, is saying a lot. Now, compared to Court of Fire, the Court of Air is generally less powerful, mostly because its units are less powerful. It is the regiments that they have access to in Court of Fire that go most of the way in pushing them up into the most powerful court status, but there are still quite a few things in Court of Air that are particularly interesting. Their rituals are okay, and we'll talk about those, but their spellcasting is some of the highest utility spellcasting in Sorcerer Kings. 2 spells that stand out in particular, and which make Court of Air desirable as a small inclusion, even if it's not the focus of the list, firstly are Homing Winds, which is a spell that just allows a friendly regiment to reroll all failed hit rolls from performing a volley action, which makes it, without question, the most powerful ranged buff in the game. There are other equivalent kind of buffs that are just that, but much worse. And given that the ranged regiments in Sorcerer Kings are generally of high quality already, getting access to Homing Winds is just hugely valuable. The other spell that's particularly interesting is Air Step, which just allows the regiment targeted by it to perform a free out-of-sequence reform action. Now, by itself, that's cool and interesting, but when you take into account entourage activations, for example, if you have an Air Court Raj in a melee unit, he has the option of casting Air Step and then entouraging into his regiment, which allows the spell to effectively give fluid formation to regiments that wouldn't otherwise have it. And given how powerful fluid formation is as a rule, having access to that is a really big deal. Now, in terms of air elemental rituals, the 2 that stand out are Farsight and Spiteful Winds. Farsight is the triple action activation ritual, and its preceding effect is to allow you to completely rearrange your command stack. Now, in practice, that is not actually as powerful as it sounds, although it certainly sounds very powerful. Mostly what you will do is you will just order your command stack as usual, and you'll put Farsight on top. And then when you draw Farsight as your first card of the round, you'll just make sure that actually, yeah, the next card that you wanted to activate is the one that you wanted to activate. Maybe you swap it with one other thing, and then you go ahead with your triple action. Meaning that in practice, the reorganization effect, it's not usually going to result in you drastically changing your plans, but it does mean that you can always use Farsight to triple action activate with whatever the best unit to benefit from that is. Now, it has to be an Air Court unit, and those are generally going to be less powerful beneficiaries than Court of Fire units, but it's still a strong effect. Spiteful Winds deserves some reference as a ritual that is of inconsistent power, but it is degenerate when it is at its strongest. Spiteful Winds just deals 4 hits to any enemy regiment on the battlefield, and then does 2 hits to every enemy regiment within 8 inches of them. If your opponent is stacked up, and in my experience it's very difficult to actually spread your whole army out far enough to avoid multiple hits from this ritual, usually this will deal 8 hits to the enemy army, which doesn't cause morale checks. Now, if your opponent has healing, or is natively high defense, or both, then this just doesn't really do very much of anything. And in fact, you can have games where an army built around casting multiple uses of Spiteful Winds every round just has to switch to using Farsight instead, And in those circumstances, Spiteful Winds doesn't feel particularly strong at all. But one of the great benefits of the ritual mechanic is that you can pick and choose which rituals from your court you prepare. And in circumstances where Spiteful Winds is strong, it is spammable. Against 100 Kingdoms, for example, one of the factions that I play, I have a lot of regiments that will be usually sitting in the rear that are defense 1, regiments like mercenary crossbows and longbowmen. Those regiments aren't cheap, particularly if they have embedded characters, and over the course of a game, casting 2 Spiteful Winds every round is going to deal so many hits to my army that this ritual, just as the Sorcerer King's army-wide special rule, can deal like 600 points of damage to my army over the course of the game. Now, that is obviously the extreme example. Almost every other faction has at least slightly higher defense, even on their backline units, or more wounds on their backline units, or access to healing, or some combination of the three. But in that specific case, you have an army-wide special rule that by the end of the game has accounted to about a 600-point advantage relative to your opponent. And that's just obscene. Now, happily, in practice, as a meta consideration, most Sorcerer King's armies being built around fire are not built around Court of Air, and then will not have access to Spiteful Whim spam as a kind of tool in their toolbox. But it is something that's worth considering. And if there is, for example, 100 Kingdoms, or maybe a Woodrun player running the right kind of list to be vulnerable to this, a Sorcerer King's player could choose to tech into Court of Air to take full advantage of this ritual. Now, the other two courts are the Court of Earth and the Court of Water, and those have few to no models released yet. In fact, it is the Mahut that is the only, although the Mahut is very good, the Mahut is the only regiment that is even released for either of these two courts yet. So we won't spend a ton of time on these. And the Court of Earth in particular is a little bit underdeveloped at the moment. Their elementals don't quite seem to work fully functionally. The Mahut is excellent, but the Eidolons that are their brute elementals look like they're waiting for another developer pass that will probably happen a bit closer to release. Water is probably also waiting for another developer pass, but for the opposite reason. Now, water spellcasting and water rituals seem good and fine. Water rituals allow you to just natively get multiple of them every round, and they are built specifically to allow that, which means you don't have to dedicate, say, a warlord slot to accessing multiple rituals. But the Married Lord in particular, if and when it's released without change, is going to just be an auto-include probably in most Sorcerer Kings lists. It's completely self-sufficient. It doesn't actually need to interact at all with the rest of your army, because what it does is create an enormous water feature and be immune to that water feature itself. It can create that water underneath enemy regiments, and the water debuff is just -1 clash. That's what water terrain does. And that means that no matter what court you are playing, you can just have one of these things splashing around, creating water wherever it is most disadvantageous for your opponent to have -1 clash on one or more of their regiments. It's not aggressively expensive, it's good in combat on its own merit, and particularly when you start combining it with things like, say, Dread from the Mahut, you can impose an effective -2 clash on any regiment fighting the Mahut because you turn off their ability to be inspired and then put them in water, and that is possibly the most negative play experience that's possible to exist in Conquest the first time someone runs into it. However, the Married Lord does not exist yet, and while we will mention it a little bit in the tier list, our primary focus is going to be on models that are actually out and regiments that you can play. And so, with that not inconsiderable introductory primer out of the way, let's rank all of the Sorcerer King's characters and regiments on an S to D tier list. Our first character is the Maharaja, and he is strolling straight into a slam dunk S tier as the first entry in the list. Now, the Maharaja, just on his own merits, is an A tier character before we consider him as a warlord. For a wizard, he has surprisingly capable combat stats with Clash 3 and 5 attacks. He also adds Resolve 4 to his regiment, which goes a very long way in ensuring that any mortal regiment or elemental regiment that he joins doesn't crumble to morale, because Sorcerer Kings, as noted, generally speaking, tend to sit at the Resolve 3 level, so Resolve 4 on a character is very welcome. He is also a Wizard 8, which is the highest native level of any wizard in the game. There are some ways to exceed that in some factions, but only by jumping through a lot of hoops. The Maharaja just sits comfortably at Wizard 8 out the gate, which means that it is very, very rare for him to fail any of his spellcasting rolls, even through interference. Now, he is pricey at 120 points, although Wizard 8 alone goes most of the way to justifying that when you consider how large Sorcerer King's spell lists are. But what puts him in S tier is Elemental Confluence, his supremacy ability. At present, you will not see any Sorcerer King's army running any warlord other than the Maharaja, which means he dominates list construction in this faction. And the reason why he dominates list construction is that he is the only way, as court of air or fire, the two currently released courts, to have multiple rituals active in a round. Now, how Elemental Confluence is kind of meant to work, or how it reads as though it's meant to work, is that it allows you to have elementals with the Elemental Conduit rule, which is one of the ways that you tick up rituals, contribute to rituals of any court. Oh, cool. The Maharaja is one of the ways that we do cross-court lists. That is really relatively insignificant. That's nice because by far the most powerful part of the Maharaja's supremacy is the following. When any ritual is successfully completed, you may immediately select one ritual you currently have access to and start preparing it. That means that you can finish a ritual in a round and then just start preparing the next one and potentially finish it too if your ritual generation is strong enough, which is the only way outside of the water court to have multiple rituals go into your deck in a round. Given how powerful rituals are, there is just no contest anywhere in the faction for supremacy. Nothing comes close to the Maharaja. This ability to have 2 or 3 rituals, and it is possible to reach 3 rituals in a round going into your deck, outcompetes literally everything else. Even in the simplest of examples, right? You will usually be able to fairly comfortably build a list that can get 2 rituals active in a round. That's not too difficult, as an average, certainly. This is usually going to translate to about 6 extra rituals, conservatively speaking, 6 extra rituals over the course of a game. And it's just not conceivable that any supremacy ability could match the power of 6 entire rituals. Remember, there are rituals that can heal 4 wounds on every one of your regiments. There are rituals that allow for triple action activations. There are rituals that do hits to enemy regiments. If Spiteful Winds does on average 8 hits per cast, and the Maharaja allows you to do 6 or 7 additional Spiteful Winds over the course of a game, then any other supremacy has to be comparable in power, not just to dealing a cumulative 50 or 60 hits to the enemy army. Just stop and imagine, right? Imagine if there was a supremacy that just read, deal 60 hits to the enemy army. That would be considered absolutely insane, but that is the cumulative value of the Maharaja supremacy, and there is the cumulative value of the activations. Activations are powerful. They are a resource in Conquest. They allow you to stall out your turn if you wanted to have late activations that your opponent can't answer. And Sorcerer Kings are tied for the highest activation count army in the game, tied only with 100 Kingdoms, and even then only at 100 Kingdoms most extreme, because of the Maharaja supremacy. He allows you to have 1 or 2 extra rituals in your deck every round, which is 1 or 2 extra activations, but without any of the downsides because you can chain from ritual into elemental if you want to. He is the most powerful warlord in the faction, and for that reason he has to sit in S. Oh, and on top of all of that, by the by, if you make him your warlord, he gets to select an entire additional court to choose spells and rituals from. Now, the main advantage of that is overcoming the cross-court limitation. In particular, I mentioned, for example, that there are a lot of air court spells that are really nice to have. Now, you don't necessarily want to dedicate an entire other spellcaster to being an air court spellcaster, but you can have a Maharaja of fire and air as your warlord, which gives you access, for example, to homing winds, even in an army that is mostly comprised of fire elementals. Now, casting homing winds won't help you progress a fire court ritual, and if you're running mostly court of fire elementals, you will be preparing mostly court of fire rituals. So there is some slowdown in the ritual machine to allow for that homing winds cast, but given the power of homing winds on a unit like Efreet Flamecasters, for example, it is well worth that small sacrifice. Very, very powerful character, S tier, and let's move on now to the next one because we've spoken about him enough. Next up is the Sorcerer, and while she does not stray into the S tier power of the Maharaja, she is a wonderful A tier spellcaster. There's really not much more you could ask for relative to what you're paying, and that cost is probably the most important thing to mention. She is only 90 points. That marks her as amongst the cheapest characters in the game, and in fact she is easily the cheapest character in Sorcerer Kings, and despite that, she is a Wizard 7, and she has full access to the spellcasting school that she selects, which means that most of the time she will have access to 6 spells with an excellent mix of spellcasting utility at Wizard 7. That's just fantastic. That's fantastic for 90 points. And on top of that, she has a reasonable ranged attack, Barrage 3, Volley 3 at range 14 inches, which allows her to just assist in the battlefield in other ways. Maybe she might be joining a gold unit that can allow that regiment to make a small range attack, which can be very meaningful, destroying objectives, for example. Or she could be in a unit like Danhur Disciples, where she might contribute some dice to their volley from time to time. Just an overall excellent character. And while she is less flashy than the Maharaja or the upcoming Raj, you will never go wrong with putting her in any of your lists. And in Sorcerer King's lists that are looking to run large quantities of characters, maybe say 4 characters for example, much of the time you'll want at least 1, sometimes 2 of those to be sorcerers just because they are cheaper. Now, our next character, and also an A, and just to note, I am fully on board with characters in armies being ranked as A tier. I think under ideal circumstances, any given faction, you want a lot of the characters you have access to be powerful centerpiece units. And it should feel really good to put characters in armies, which is why I think it's fantastic that the Sorcerer and the Raj are both A tier. And the Raj is comfortably A tier. Now, while he is much more expensive than the Sorcerer, he clocks in at 120 points, the same cost as the Maharaja. He is a Wizard 7, just like the Sorcerer, but rather than being cheap, he is expensive, but you absolutely get what you pay for. There are a few rules that are worth mentioning here. The first is that he has forward force. This is the only source of flank in the faction, which means the regiment that the Raj is attached to will always arrive when you want them to without needing to worry about rolling dice. Particularly if you are putting him in like powerful medium elemental units, this gets them onto the battlefield at a key time, which is also very valuable for a host of reasons, but it's especially valuable in Sorcerer Kings. Reliably getting regiments onto the battlefield early accelerates your ritual creation. Because those elemental regiments, for example, will start adding tokens to rituals, the Raj himself is a spellcaster, a Wizard 7, which means his spells will also add tokens to rituals. So having flank on a spellcaster in an elemental unit is just very high value in terms of interfacing with the faction mechanics. It's also very valuable because, as I kind of mentioned, Sorcerer Kings can take a little bit of time to spool up to their maximum strength. That can create a window of vulnerability where the faction can be a little bit subject to early enemy control or aggression, and the Raj just helps answer that by making sure that as early as turn 2, if he's in a medium regiment, the bulk of your force is available and present to respond to enemy aggression. If all of that wasn't enough, he's also just a good combat character. Clash 3 and 5 attacks is not outstanding, but he does have Flurry, and he is Resolve 4, just like the Maharaja, which is particularly relevant. The Maharaja will often, because he's so valuable, be sitting in like a backline regiment. He can fight, but he's not a fighting character. You mostly want the Maharaja to spellcast. The Raj, with Flurry, Resolve 4 is proportionally more meaningful because the Raj will almost always be in a combat unit. And that flurry also starts to interact when we think about putting artifacts and masteries on the Raj. And it's worth just noting at this point one of the combination of effects that is available in Sorcerer Kings, and that is the Blender Raj. Now, to build a Blender Raj, you're going to spend about 150 points, and you're going to want a few things. Firstly, usually you'll make him Court of Fire so that he can join a Court of Fire melee elemental unit, and to give him access to the Molten Blade spell, which can be used to give himself and his regiment Cleave 1 and Deadly Blades. We're then going to pay 15 points to give him Bound to the Elements, which will change him to a Brute, allowing him to join an Efreet unit, giving him +2 wounds and +2 attacks and Impact 3. Ah, okay, that's just increased his attack count to the point where Flurry is starting to look very appealing. On top of that, we're going to spend 15 more points, taking him to 150, to give him the magical weapon Prim? I'm not sure how you pronounce that, Kanjar, which gives him a further +2 attacks and flawless strikes, which means once everything is online, he will be in a regiment that can benefit from triple action activations, and he personally will be Clash 3 with Flurry, Impact 3, with 9 attacks with Cleave 1, Flawless Strikes, and Deadly Blades, which is just an enormous amount of damage. He can even duel reasonably well because his wound count is increased to 6, which is usually enough to survive a duel against anything short of himself, basically, for at least one round of that fight. Now, Astoundingly, I actually spent a fair bit of time sitting down and doing the math on most dangerous non-monster characters in the game, and to my great surprise, the Raj is in fact not the most dangerous character in the game. Even setting aside monsters, there are a very small number of characters from Wodrun and Euroni and the Hundred Kingdoms that can outperform a Raj in about the same points bracket, but even then only by a very small amount, and none of those characters are Wizard 7. Now, obviously, that combination of abilities, of masteries, and patrons gifts you can only have one of, and so while I am going to put the Raj at just slightly higher than the Sorcerer, if we're actually thinking about it, just for clarity, that ranking is for the first of each of those characters. Just because of the points difference, I would generally say that the second Sorcerer I would very slightly rank very slightly higher than the second Raj. But both are very good and the ranking is very close, which is excellent because it is really nice to see characters ranked highly in tier lists like that, because that's where a lot of the excitement for the faction comes from, since you have to take characters and they are in many cases the core of your army. Now, in very stark contrast, we have the Mahabharati Sardar, which is being placed in D, but with a very big asterisk. The Sardar was originally conceived of as kind of like a mortal commander in and amongst the wizards, and he was probably the worst character in the game and just didn't really do anything or didn't function for the entirety of that time. He's been redesigned recently to be one of the Mahabharati, mortals who are bound to elements and get sorceress or gifts as a result, but he is still a work in progress. It is extremely likely that we will see the Sardar have further iterations, and the premise is absolutely there. He has some very interesting rules where he's able to draw on the power of accruing rituals to fuel his unit, to gain benefits, and that's cool and is a very interesting concept. Right now, he is 120 points, and a Raj he is not, so he just gets outcompeted. On top of that, drawing tokens from rituals in a faction where you will have the Maharaja as your warlord 100% of the time is not a valuable mechanic. If you could only have one ritual prepared per round, and therefore there were surplus tokens, the Sardar would potentially be quite valuable. But because the Maharaja allows you to just keep preparing rituals and funneling them into your deck, every single token you generate has 100% of possible value. The Sardar only becomes practical to include in a list where there are surplus tokens that you might siphon off and still hit the number of rituals that you want to hit, i.e. one, in any given round. So right now, he just does not work in the army as it functions, but he is marked as a work in progress. We know that this is a character that Parabellum will continue to look at, and that means right now he fits quite earnestly in the D tier, but with the expectation that he will change, possibly quite soon, because the next balance update is not terribly far away. Now, from characters, we will head into our light regiments, and there is only a single light regiment in Sorcerer Kings, and it is Goals. Now, as noted, quite a bit of the content for this video has been workshopped with Ewan, Sorcerer Kings player, but goals are a ritual where I'm going to disagree with Ewan's assessment because I think he has allowed himself to be gaslit by the Discord. Ewan had ranked goals as a C because he feels that all of the time he has to go to the Discord and say, okay, hear me out, you should take these regiments. And that's kind of how we've chosen to use C as a category. A regiment whose existence you need to kind of just justify and make sense of, not an easy or an automatic include. However, in this case, I think that reflects a failure on the online community's behalf to recognize that this unit is good and valuable, and in fact, it's the children who are wrong in this case because goals are a very solid and sound regiment. They are not A tier, but they are good both on their own merits and in terms of what they add to the faction. Now, the stat line, just to begin with, it is fine. They are movement 5 but Vanguard 4, which puts them at passable speed. In terms of the speed that you want from a light regiment, they will set an aggressive reinforcement line. Once they're on the board, they're only movement 5, but they do have Unstoppable, which gives them a serviceable enough threat range, and they are a melee regiment, Clash 2, but with 6 attacks, which makes them an ample vehicle for force multiplication, for example, given Cleave 1 and Deadly Blades by a friendly spellcaster. Now, they are not especially durable. At 110 points, I wouldn't particularly expect them to be, but they are only Defense 2, Evasion 1, and Resolve 2, which makes them pretty easy to crack with any given swing. Now, despite this, right, the fact that they are a light melee regiment, I am still firmly of the opinion that they are at least a B tier regiment because, firstly, at 110 points, they are the cheapest regiment in the faction and the second cheapest activation in the faction only after the Sorcerer Kings. Thanks to the Maharaja's supremacy, you can play an activation control game in Sorcerer Kings, and part of that is going to involve one or more regiments of goals. Secondly, board development is a challenge for Sorcerer Kings. Just having a light unit or two light units in a list gets you a couple of things onto the board early. Not necessarily to go and engage the enemy, because against an aggressive enemy, goals, particularly unsupported goals, will die, but to start building that force and that table presence, which means that when your medium regiments begin to arrive en masse, because you will have lots of medium regiments in Sorcerer Kings, and some of them will have flank, by having just some light regiments in the list, you accelerate that board development to a point where you can start matching what would otherwise be a threat to you as an army. Finally, they have Elemental Conduit, which means that they add ritual tokens to rituals. At 110 points, they are, after the Sorcerer, the cheapest way to get a ritual token every single turn, and because they are a light regiment, they are beginning to add ritual tokens to rituals from the first turn. They also, for that reason, make a surprisingly good home for the Sorcerer. If you have a Fire Sorcerer, she can buff them with Deadly Blades and Cleave 1, which makes them actually a thoroughly credible melee threat. She increases their Resolve. She's Resolve 3, so that brings their Resolve up to 3. Now, it's still not a durable regiment, but it's a regiment that can take perhaps one hit before crumbling, and which is dangerous on the clapback because it has so many attacks with Cleave and Deadly Blades. But more importantly, if you have a goal with a Sorcerer in it arriving on the first turn, firstly, that's 2 activations on turn 1, which pads out your activation count for the remainder of the game. Secondly, it's 2 ritual tokens on turn 1. And if you are looking to really spool up your ritual game and have lots of ritual power and fully lean into the maximum amount of threat and healing and damage that you can generate with the ritual mechanic, up to 2 sorcerers in goals can get you lots of tokens early that you would otherwise have to wait just one more turn to begin coming onto the field. And all of that collectively means that goals don't really need to be justified in an army because there are so many different individual things that they can add. If you are a Sorcerer Kings player, you should probably own 2 of these units. You can even justify 3 in some cases, not with the expectation that they will ever carry the game for you by themselves. They are fragile, they are reasonably dangerous, but they are a fragile light regiment. But what they contribute to the overall plan and to your magic and to your rituals coming online really shouldn't be underestimated, even before we get to how they contribute to more advanced concepts like the power of activation control. Now, from here, we move into the mediums, and in approximate alphabetical order, we are starting with Danhur Disciples, which are another comfortable B tier unit. This is just a good volley regiment. They are mortal, they are infantry, which means that all characters can join them easily, and for that reason, they make probably the best generic character bunker, although more specialized options like goals and other things will generally exist. As a default, there is nothing wrong with putting any of your non-Raj, non-Sardar characters in a Danhur Disciple unit. They are movement 6, they have actually surprisingly good defensive stats with defense 2 resolve 3, which makes them more durable than basically any comparable ranged regiment. And they have an 18-inch range, 5 dice barrage, volley 2 with arcing fire. That's just good. It's 140 points and it's just a good ranged unit. I would often expect to see a unit of Danhur Disciples as a home perhaps for a Maharaja or a Sorcerer, going onto a zone to score it for the entire game and contribute range fire out to a reasonable distance. These guys are just solid and sound. 18 inches is not the longest range in the game, but it's not too bad either. It is better than many ranged units. Barrage 5 is excellent, particularly given their cost. They are, for example, cheaper than marksman clones. And the only things that really hold Danhur Disciples back, ultimately, firstly, are that they are a mortal regiment, which means they don't have any elemental synergies. They don't have any rules that turn on as a result of triggering different rituals, etc. What you see is what you get, and there's no special extra effects, which means that after you've taken, say, 1 unit of Danhur to put a character in, you will always be reaching for elementals with powerful and flashy and triggered effects because the high watermark for those elementals is so much higher. And secondly, that the best synergy with them is still a little bit awkward. Because they have Barrage 5, they are a tremendous target for homing winds, if you have access to that. But if you take a unit of Danho Disciples, you're very likely to put a Maharaja, for example, in the Danho Disciples, which means that the regiment is now 4 strong, which means scaling triggers, which means even the Wizard 8 Maharaja will just occasionally fail to cast homing winds. Now, in practice, not the end of the world, because one of the next units we'll be talking about is so much more powerful in terms of range power that they will usually suck down all of your support instead, but it is something that's worth considering. Danho Disciples are just good. You could not ask for any more of them in terms of stats. The fact that they are Defense 2 and Resolve 3 and March 6 means that their secondary characteristics are all just a bit better than you expect, and their range units, that range attacks don't suffer to compensate. Just good. Now, Efreet Flamecasters, as mentioned, are the regiment that are the reason why you don't often worry about the fact that Danho Disciples are of a unit size when a character joins them to trigger scaling and therefore harder to cast Homing Winds on, because if you have Homing Winds, you will be casting it on Flamecasters most of the time instead. Now, perhaps more than any other regiment, Flamecasters showcase the many strengths, but also the small number of limitations that Sorcerer Kings are subject to. Firstly, just as a baseline assessment, these guys are on an Elemental Brute chassis, which means 5 wounds, defense 3, resolve 3. Survivable enough without being really durable. 170 points is very reasonably costed. They are a Volley 2, Barrage 5, Range 14 Rapid Volley unit, which is a very solid ranged profile. And the rest of the stat line is good enough to almost consider them to be a multi-role unit because they still have Impact 3 and they still have 5 attacks. Only Clash 2, but this regiment as an MSU, if it's caught in melee, is still putting out 16 attacks on 3s, which means it's going to inflict on average 8 hits, which is enough to do significant damage to, say, a light enemy unit that's charged to engage them, which is far, far better than you would usually expect from a dedicated ranged unit. These guys are good enough in melee, they will sometimes make plays from charging, and that makes them a multi-role unit, which is rare and valuable in Conquest. But it is the ranged power that we're really here to talk about. Now, starting with, obviously, Rapid Volley, Barrage 5, etc. Where we begin to see synergies is when we trigger the Inflamed special rule. If every Flamecasters are themselves inflamed or targeting an inflamed enemy, and you generate inflamed by attacking it with a unit of Flamecasters, another unit of Flamecasters, or by casting spells or using rituals, their Rapid Volley doesn't trigger on a 1, it triggers on a 1 or a 2. Now, Rapid Volley is not mathematically identical to +1 volley, but it's very, very close. The average is the same, it is just a higher variance rule. Rapid Volley tends to produce situations where you have more on the low end and more on the high end, rather than clustered around the center, but it is approximately mathematically equivalent to +1 volley, and triggering it on 1s and 2s is approximately mathematically equivalent to another +1 volley. And that means if you want a shorthand, you can think of Efreet Flamecasters as a Barrage 5 Volley 4 regiment before they aim, because that is approximately the number of hits they will cause. Again, noting that it's a bit more complicated than that. That's just really, really good. These guys do obscene number of hits, and in practice, the effect that you will see is that you will have any given turn an army with, say, 3 Flamecaster units. 2 of them will do totally serviceable damage. They will be good units that will do something significant. They'll do lots of hits. You'll spool up. Maybe they won't be able to aim, but they will benefit from inflamed. They'll have to march and shoot, and they'll do 10 hits. And that's good. That's good. That's an excellent ranged attack from a 170 point unit. But in any given turn, one of those 3 units is just going to roll surprisingly well and deal 20 hits to you. And that just blows out an MSU or deals a huge amount of damage to a regiment that was relying on Tenacious or something. And that, like the fact that you can easily take, right? There are no limitations on how many of these you can take other than the maximum limitations on a number of regiment period, which means that most Sorcerer King's competition armies can easily have 3 or more. Like 4 is not uncommon, right? A army with 4 Flamecasters gets around the variance issue posed by Rapid Volley by just having so many Flamecasters that in any given turn, one of them is going to hit that overperformance spike. And anytime a Flamecaster unit hits an overperformance spike, it does so much damage that in that moment can be backbreaking in power. On top of that, because they are Court of Fire elementals, they have full synergy with all of the other rituals, which means that thanks to Fiery Dominion, they are almost impossible to bring down with chip damage because you can just easily heal through. Like if you are having a ranged duel, maybe there's a Hellbringer Drake and a unit of Ballistae, maybe there's a unit of Longbows, right? You're having a ranged duel with Flamecasters and you get some hits in on them before they close. That damage is going to disappear because of how powerful Fiery Dominion is, and you can use Fiery Dominion multiple times in a turn, making these guys effectively immune to chip damage. The only way to kill them is to break and shatter them, and that's not feasible on a ranged unit before it has had a chance to attack you, and the high watermark damage for Flamecasters is very high. Now, for all of that power, and this is a very, very powerful unit when it is leveraging the full synergies available to it, it is also a little bit of a showcase in how you don't just get all of those synergies for free. The easiest of them are the rituals. The rituals will happen mostly by themselves with relatively little requirement to manage. You have to exercise a degree of foresight. You need to think about which of the Fire Court rituals, and all three of the Fire Court rituals have certain amounts of play. You need to think about which of them you're going to need in a future turn. You need to start developing those, and then you need to put them in your deck. But on the assumption that Fiery Dominion is one of those, you will always easily trigger the Inflamed rule. And if you have multiple Fiery Dominions, you'll be able to easily use the first of them to inflame all of your Flamecasters, and the second of them, late in the turn, to heal all of your Flamecasters. But after that, we begin to see sort of complexities begin to emerge, because getting particularly like a third ritual in any given turn, that's a bit more complex. If we want to have conflagration for the triple activation on any of our units, of our Flamecaster units or our Sword Dancer units, well, we need to figure out how we're going to order that compared to Fiery Dominion. Because if you're going to use Fiery Dominion to inflame all of our guys and heal them, well, then we can't do that and then chain straight into conflagration, which means that we're not going to have our most powerful activation on the first activation of the turn. We have to wait. And we have to wait again if we want to have Homing Winds. I mentioned Homing Winds is probably the most powerful range buff in the game. And on Flamecasters, it's disgusting because all of that shorthand math about how rapid volley is approximately equivalent to +1 volley goes out the window once we have rerolls, because we are rerolling a proportionally larger number of dice. We are not actually volley 4, we are just simulated volley 4, which means rerolls have a proportionally more powerful effect on Efreet Flamecasters, which starts getting us those "you did how many hits" moments, but you don't get Homing Winds onto a unit of Efreet except by casting it, then passing playback to your opponent, and then activating the Efreet with a subsequent activation. Now, you can have a fully online armed and operational Efreet unit happen every single turn, but first you need to cast Homing Winds, and then you need to trigger some way of getting inflamed, which might be a ritual, but if it's a ritual, it's not conflagration, which means you are triple activating, which means you aren't move, aim, and shoot. And so we see all of the little frictions that prevent the hypothetical best case scenario from materializing easily. Despite all of that, these guys are still S tier. They are incredibly powerful, and on those occasions where it's the fourth or fifth activation in a round, where the Sorcerer King's player has comfortable activation control and the fight has not been aggressively joined, the things that you will see from Flamecasters are disgusting. Under ideal circumstances, you have a regiment that is able to march forward 6 inches, then march forward 6 inches again, then shoot 14, with 4 rerolls, triggering 2 hits on a 1 or a 2, which can blow out an entire MSU comfortably, set up an attritional advantage that the Sorcerer King can ride for the remainder of the game. The high watermark is extremely powerful. The fact that getting there against a strong player is not guaranteed merely relegates the Flamecasters back to one of the best range units in the game, and they are a mainstay that can be taken in Court of Fire, and they can be taken en masse in a way that completely overcomes any variability issues that they have. Just an outstanding regiment and an S tier as a result. Now, after Flamecasters, we have our second Court of Fire Brute, Sword Dancers, and by comparison, these guys are merely very good, but they are very good within entirely acceptable limits. As you might expect, Sword Dancers are the melee equivalent of Flamecasters. They have relentless blows rather than rapid volley. They have a very nice melee profile, but no native access to cleave or deadly blades. 6 attacks and impact 3 on Clash 3, but otherwise a stock elemental brute profile is just really good at putting out lots of hits. But because they are a melee regiment, the fact that they are just, heavy use of air quotes, 5 wounds, defense 3, resolve 3, is going to play a little bit more than it will for a unit like Flamecasters, who are a ranged unit and less susceptible to getting one-shot by a decisive enemy melee attack. Now, on the flip side, it is on the Sword Dancers that we see the fire elemental rule come into full effect, and that is it's effectively Juggernaut all of the time. You do need to be inflamed or targeting an inflamed enemy, but provided you are inflamed, and again that's fairly easy to do, particularly for those times in the game where a melee unit will be activating, you just get Juggernaut, and Juggernaut's one of the best abilities in the game, which means these guys have got fixed 11-inch charge distances. That is a really long way, and they have the melee damage output to capitalize. They also synergize, as you might expect, extremely well with the juiced up Blender Raj, because not only does he add his own massive personal offensive output to the unit, but Molten Blades is custom made for juicing up the Sword Dancers. It gives them Cleave 1, it gives them Deadly Blades, and it makes them inflamed, which means that as the first activation of the round, you can have the Raj activate, cast Molten Blades, and then entourage straight into the regiment with an 11-inch charge distance, which is very, very strong, and they will do a ton of damage. One of the premier melee regiments in the game when all of that lines up. And the only point of friction there is that you do need to succeed on casting the spell with a Wizard 7. Molten Blades is somewhat inexplicably not scaling, but if interference comes into play, or even if it doesn't, it is very possible to fail to cast that spell, which can be terrible when it happens and you are relying on the Juggernaut charge. But even under interference, he will still usually succeed, and when he does and that regiment pops off, it absolutely pops off. They don't reach level of Flamecasters, and an MSU of Sword Dancers is merely a good, fast, and flexible regiment, and for that reason they sit comfortably in the A tier. Up next, we have our first medium court of Air Brute, the Steelheart Djinn, and these guys are a solid B tier. 180 points is pricey. What you get for that relative to a Fire Djinn, Fire Efreet rather, is it Cleave 2, basically. Fire Efreet don't have any Cleave natively, they're reliant on spells to get Cleave or Deadly Blades. The Steelheart Djinn just have very large glaives and so natively hit Cleave 2, and there are times when that is very, very valuable. They are also March 7, which means that they get up the board more aggressively and obviously have natively further charge before the Incredible Juggernaut rule comes into play. And they have access to the niche but very cool rule on Soaring Winds, which is an in combat or out of combat action that allows them to just leave combat or march full distance sideways or backwards, which is again not going to come up hugely often. Most of the movement that we make in this game is more or less straight line forward, but on those occasions when it matters, it's very cool. Now, not unsurprisingly, a lot like Sword Dancers, some of the strongest synergy that you will have with the Steelheart Djinn is with a Raj who joins them. You can only have one of those Raj per army because Bound to the Elements is a limited rule. You can only have one of those in a given force. But in exactly the same way as a Raj casting Molten Blades in a unit of Sword Dancers is exceptional, a Raj casting Air Step on a unit of Windborn Djinn to give them the free reform, and then Entourage activating into a charge is fantastic. As we noted when talking about the Air Court, this is effectively fluid formation on a unit that is not balanced around having fluid formation, and the threat ranges and mobility and maneuverability, as is fitting for Air Court, is just extremely good. When they don't have a Raj joining them, however, this unit is just fine. The expense ultimately keeps them in B tier because 180 points is more than 170 points. And for units that don't have the Raj joining them, Juggernaut on the Sword Dancers is a much better rule than anything that the Steelheart Djinn have access to. Still a solid unit, and there is relatively limited access to Cleave in this army otherwise, so having Cleave 2 does make them very solid. Windborn Djinn, by comparison, the ranged version, are suffering considerably. These guys are somewhere between C and D tier. I'm going to put them in C rather than D because I don't quite think they fall into the category of their rules just don't function. But they do suffer very badly, both in comparison with other ranged regiments in the faction. They have the same range as Nanoho Disciples, and they're just outperformed in every way by Flamecasters. But they also don't do terribly well in comparison to the regiments of other factions. Unlike Flamecasters, these guys only have 4 attacks rather than 5, which means that they can't be considered quite as much a multi-role regiment. And while Barrage 3, Range 18, Armor Piercing 1 is not bad, especially with Volley 3, it's not great either. That's an okay ranged profile, and 180 points kind of demands at least a marginally more elite ranged profile. Now, personally, I don't think they're very far away from being good. A very small points reduction, or a very small like additional rule or little range buff. Like of only very small changes would be required to bring the Windborn Djinn up to a solid B tier unit. But for as long as they exist in their current state, they are inevitably going to be compared to Flamecasters, and Flamecasters just so significantly outperform them for fewer points that by sheer comparison within faction, the Windborn Djinn are forced down. They don't even have a niche like Danho Disciples of being able to hold a mortal character, which means they're just not doing anything that another regiment in the faction doesn't do better. Yes, there is a range difference. They have 4 more inches and 1 more speed than Flamecasters, but the output of Flamecasters justifies putting the force multiplication into them to overcome that delta, at which point Windborn Djinn are left in C tier. With the elemental courts now done, let's go through our mortals in medium, and that starts with the Mahabharati. Now, these guys have a weird grab bag of rules that does not quite overcome some small fundamental issues, but ultimately does make them very interesting. Defense 2, Evasion 2 with 4 wounds, even with Resolve 4, is a fragile stat line for 160 points. These guys are just a bit easier than you would like to bring down, particularly with things like peppering ranged fire, since they are not natively an elemental unit, and so it's a bit more work to do things like heal them with Fiery Dominion. That fragility is the main thing that stands in the way of them being ranked significantly higher, and it is really the only bad thing about them. 160 points, otherwise being a relatively high points cost. Otherwise, they're a surprisingly solid offensive package. Movement 6 with a standard bearer is reasonably fast. They are Clash 3, 5 attacks with Cleave 1 and Linebreaker, and as a 100 Kingdoms player, I am contractually obligated to hate Linebreaker in all of its forms and consider it to be a preeminent offensive rule, since all of my regiments basically have shields. But even setting aside my 100 Kingdoms shield bias, that's still just a good offensive output. Now, it's not as good as elementals, but they do have the elemental conduit rule, which means they generate ritual tokens unlike other mortals. For some reason, they are a, well, not for some reason, because of thematic reasons, they are a wizard one, which means that if you did not already have interference bubbles out the wazoo, they are a little bit more interference. And if they're targeted by an enemy spell, their evasion cranks to evasion 4, making them not immune, but very, very resilient to enemy offensive spell casting. Now, all of that wouldn't necessarily add up to a preeminent regiment, but if you are taking a second Raj in the list, because Forward Force is a very good ability and Raj are a very good character, he needs to go somewhere, because only the first Raj, the one who takes Bound to the Elements, can go in your Elemental Brute Regiment of choice. And because the Raj is good, and because frankly a second Raj is also good, it's the synergy with the Raj that elevates the Mahabharati up to pretty comfortably, like the bottom of, but pretty comfortably B tier. Because that second Raj, if you take them, has to go somewhere, and Mahabharati are a relatively clear choice. They are more durable than Goals. They are more dangerous than Goals, and they work nicely with the Raj. There's a little bit of awkwardness if you have a Fire Raj, since obviously they already have Cleave 1, so he's not giving that to them. But they work very nicely with an Air Court Raj if that's something that you want to take, since pseudo-fluid formation, March 6 with a standard bearer on a moderately wide regiment is a very long threat range with all of the other flexibility of fluid formation. These guys are just generally pretty cool and pretty interesting, and they even have a little bit of bad luck insurance baked in the form of gifted mortals, which means that if you want to put a Raj in the regiment and have advantage of those entourage things, gifted mortals means that spells that target them from your friendlies that increase them always count as if they had rolled the number of necessary successes, which means that you can't whoops and fail that fluid formation spell, which is just nice quality of life, and for all of those collective interesting reasons, the Mahabharati slot in at the bottom of B tier. Finally, our last medium regiment, our mortals, the Rajukar infantry, come in as kind of a C+, certainly outperforming things like the Windborn Djinn, because they are only 120 points. These guys are a regiment that I feel like would probably be better received in any other army, but don't quite have a niche in Sorcerer Kings. They are very generic human stat lines. Clash 2, 4 attacks, 4 wounds, defense 2 with a shield. Where they justify a small amount of additional expense, and really only a very small amount, is that they are natively Resolve 3, and they natively have Hardened 1. Now, on paper, that's a totally serviceable stat line, It's just that they're not a regiment you really have any particular use for. Because they are mortals, they are not elementals, they have no special synergies with anything that the faction is trying to do. They have no synergy with any of the triggers for various elemental special rules. They have no triggers with the rituals. They don't do anything special other than be a medium unit that walks onto the battlefield and potentially holds a point. And they aren't even particularly relevant as a character bunker, because S, A, and B tiers of this tier list are all full of things that are better for that purpose. Do you want a cheap infantry unit that arrives early to get ritual markers flowing from your spellcasting? You take goals. Do you want a unit whose only job is to sit on an objective zone and otherwise contribute to the battlefield? You take Danho Disciples, because then their ranged attack is relevant. Do you want an actual dangerous combat unit? Well, you take Bound to the Elements and put the Raj, for example, in an Elemental Brute regiment, or you take Mahabharati Initiates who actually do enough damage in combat, even if they're a bit more fragile, to justify their use. All of those other regiments have actual clear use cases, whereas the Rajakar they're just cheap. And if I wanted cheap, I would take goals, and if I wanted scoring, I would take Danher Disciples. And that leaves the niche of Rajakar as, I really want this character to go in a medium regiment, and I don't have 20 points spare to upgrade to Danher Disciples. That's a very narrow niche, even if, on paper, there's nothing at all wrong with the Rajaka stat line, it's just that there is no synergy with the army. Now, from here, we get into our heavy regiments, and this means Court of Fire and our first Court of Earth unit. And we will start with the Mahut, who is a comfortable A tier monster. Now, he is a heavy monster in a faction that already has some issues running out its development, and that makes Sorcerer Kings very much a one of heavy. If you want to take a heavy, you take one so that you can guarantee its arrival on turn 3. But if you are taking a heavy regiment, there are a couple of good choices, and the Mahut is one of those. And the Mahut, unashamedly, is an absolute tank. Now, there are two ways a Mahut will typically be taken, with or without a Maharaja on top. If you don't take the Maharaja, then the Mahut has a number of Danho Disciples riding on top who give it a small volley. That is very nice to have. It's a free additional action. It will generate value for you turn on turn. You can even use the volley while it's in combat. It's just really nice to have. And notwithstanding my comments about Sorcerer Kings being a one of heavy faction, you actually can genuinely do a March of the Elephants army. It's a bit of a meme, but when you start seeing multiple Mahut on the battlefield, all of a sudden it's when those volleys begin to add up. The other way of playing a Mahut is as a mount for a Maharaja. This causes the Maharaja to displace the Danho Disciples. You lose the volley action entirely, which can feel like a little bit of a raw deal given that you are paying 15 points. But you gain a couple of things. The first and most important is that you gain Terrifying 1. And this is significant not just because the Mahut and the Maharaja will remember, is not actually particularly bad in close combat. The Maharaja has 5 attacks with Clash 3, which goes a fairly long way to increasing the Mahut's damage output, but also, once the Maharaja is in combat, if he is casting offensive spells, say he is a Maharaja Warlord of the Courts of Fire and Earth, then those offensive spells will benefit from Terror as well. And so, actually, this is by no means bad. It's very, very solid to have a Maharaja, technically, or a Sorcerer, but the Maharaja's better combat stats make him a much better choice. The Maharaja on a Mahut is probably the most common way that you will see one of these run. It's a very solid way to have a Maharaja Warlord enter the battlefield. Since you have to be Court of Earth to take the Favored of Hormus Mastery, you can have an army that is still otherwise completely fire focused, and have the Maharaja Fire and Earth Courts on the Mahut, getting all of the benefit from the Mahut. And as noted, the Mahut is incredibly durable. Now, 240 points is not cheap. This is an expensive regiment, and its damage output is just kind of okay. 10 attacks with Clash 2, with Cleave 1 and Linebreaker actually means that on average you're dealing 5 Cleave 1 Linebreaker hits, which is not terribly much. Now, we've also got Trample 5, which is fantastic, and the Maharaja on the back will add his own clash, which is how we actually get the Mahut up to decent damage output. But despite the slightly anemic damage output, it's the durability that we're taking this guy for. With the Maharaja, this model is Resolve 4. It has 20 wounds, it is Hardened 1, it has Dread, and it is untouchable thanks to the Earth Elemental rule. Earth Elemental, which we haven't mentioned previously, is while this regiment is within 3 inches of an Earth marker, which is a type of terrain that Earth Elementals create, the regiment gains Untouchable, but if you're being ridden by a Maharaja with Favored of Hormus, you just always get that, which makes this thing just colossally hard to kill. Dread, huge wound count, oblivious, high resolve, hardened, like these things are tanks. They are fun, they are strong, they are very durable. With the Maharaja riding them, their damage output also becomes entirely serviceable. And while they absolutely don't creep up into S tier because the compromises that you make in taking them, not least because they are heavy, mean that they will always be a sometimes food, they are nevertheless really good. Also to note, as I mentioned, when the Marid Lord comes out, the fact that you have this huge and durable Dread regiment, you'll be able to further improve its durability by having the Marid Lord dump water on the heads of whatever is engaging the Mahout, which is going to just be terrifying. Finally, and we'll kind of rank them at the same time, we have our two Rakshasa, the Ravenar and the Bakasura. These guys share a lot of commonalities. They are Fire Court, Elemental, fast, dangerous, heavy regiments. Speed 7 is particularly quick, with identical defensive profiles, 16 wounds, defense 3, evasion 1, and 4 resolve. They are fire elementals, which means they get Juggernaut, and because they are fire elementals, the Juggernaut limitation of not being able to be further modified is ignored, allowing them to add extra modifiers on top, which each of them has, and that's where we're going to see the differences between the two. Now, the Ravenar is the cheaper of the two, but we're ranking it in C tier while the Bakasura is in A tier, and that's because of the different focus that each of them has. The Ravenar is kind of billed as an enemy monster hunter. It has Fiend Hunter. Like the Bakasura, it has Aura of Death, good clash, good number of attacks, terrifying, etc. But where the Bakasura is built around killing characters, the Ravenar is built around killing monsters, and therefore it has Fiend Hunter, and it gets plus 3 inches of charge distance when charging an enemy monster. Now it is cheaper, 220 points, but ultimately the reason why it goes in C tier and the Bakasura goes in A tier is that every single enemy army in the game will have characters, and not every single enemy army in the game will have monsters. Very often you'll play against a list that has no or one monster, whereas basically in fact, every army you play against will always have at least 2 characters, usually 3, sometimes 4, sometimes 5 or 6 if there's a degenerate 100 Kingdoms player around. And that means the Bakasura just has a much, much higher use case. Now, on top of that, despite being more expensive, it's also got just kind of a nicer offensive profile. The Ravenar has higher cleave at cleave 2, but it only has 12 attacks, whereas the Bakasura has 15 attacks at cleave 1, which is just more consistent. On top of that, arrogance is just a very, very powerful rule. It gets plus 3 inches of charge distance when performing a charge against an enemy regiment with a character, and it can perform a free duel action as if it were a character stand. This comes with all of the usual benefits of forcing an enemy character to decline a duel, and in addition, if an enemy character declines a duel, and they usually will against a Clash 3 15 attack Cleave 1 Terror 1 monster, the Bakasura gets Flurry. And it is in the Bakasura that we start to see some of the most ridiculous melee threat ranges in the game. Because Arrogance is very easy to trigger, because the enemy will always have characters, and because Ignite is relatively easy to trigger, meaning that you will almost always have Juggernaut, just out the gate, most of the time, the Bakasura will be making fixed distance 15-inch charge movements. That's the longest charge range basically in the game. Technically, it can be exceeded by a small number of Spires units if they roll well, but we can extend that charge distance even further. Remember, we can give elemental units triple actions, which means the Bakasura can go not just 15 inches on the charge clash, but 22 inches on the charge clash by going March charge clash with a triple activation. If we want to, there's a Court of Air spell that gives plus 2 inches on a regiment's first march, which means we can get a 24-inch march charge clash if we're willing to go all out. Now in practice, most of the time, no, it will be only 22 inches, but that is still half of the table that you are crossing to reach melee and then make a clash with a very powerful Aura of Death impact multiple attack monster who is just absolutely capable of messing up most of the things that he will hit. Now, I am ranking him quite deliberately between the Raj and the Sword Dancers. In terms of elemental payoff, he is only going to be even remotely consistently outperformed by Flamecasters and a Raj's unit with Bound to the Elements. Otherwise, one of these guys in a given Court of Fire list represents just a like unfathomably long charge threat range. And even if you don't make use of the full triple activation, remember he is a triple action regiment natively. You can park him 15 inches away from an enemy regiment with a character at the end of the turn, and then just not worry about the rituals. You can just charge, duel, and clash. Or if you think you're going to break the enemy regiment with your clash, charge, clash, and then duel. Just very, very solid. Now, he is fragile, but remember, this is Court of Fire. We have access to a very powerful healing ritual. And so, provided you can keep your opponent from collapsing in on and killing the Bakasura in a round, he's going to potentially heal 4 or 8 or even 12 in some cases, very unlikely, wounds in a round from Fiery Dominion's incredible army-wide healing effect. That just makes him very, very good. The only thing that holds him back is that he is a heavy regiment, and there is a limit to how much you can delay your run out as Sorcerer Kings, which limits you for practical purposes to 1 or maybe 2 of these guys. You can make 2 work only because of that extreme threat range. It is not the end of the world if one of these arrives on turn 4, because on turn 5 it can charge so far that its threat range extends across most of the table in any case. Now, that wraps up all of the released models, but just for the sake of completeness, we are going to talk a little bit about where we might hypothetically land some of the courts in general. Of these, the weaker of the 2 unreleased courts, the Court of Earth, we're going to put very tentatively toward the bottom of B. I don't think the Eidolons are bad, but I do think their rules and role are a little bit confused. And I have a very strong suspicion that the rules we have seen for them are going to go through a little bit more iteration before the models come out. If you are a Sorcerer Kings player and the pre-order drops, I would also wait to see just how the rules for them change before locking in a purchase. There's a little bit of room for upward movement, just a little bit of room for upward movement on the Eidolons, particularly if stuff like, say, the Fire Court or the Maharaja's Supremacy changes in the next balance update. Sort of the same but opposite is the Water Court, which will sit somewhere between S and A. For the sake of conservatism, for now, let's just put them in A tier. The Water Court promises to be very, very powerful. But how that power materializes is going to depend, firstly, on whether or not the Maharaja stays the same or is altered, and then whether or not their rules stay the same or is altered, which is basically me saying the Water Court will be good unless they change. Thank you, Rob. That's the insight everyone is here for. But what I mean by that is, right now, all of the Water Court elementals, especially the Merid Lord, but all of them are really interesting. You've got cool spellcasting on regiments, which is one of my favorite things in the game. The Water Cavalry are expensive and do need setup, but can do just a lot of damage. Like, they have one of the best charges in the game if you can line that all up. And I've talked at length about how the Merid Lord being able to generate water terrain is potentially borderline broken. What will hold the Water Court back, if anything does, is simply the existence of the Maharaja, because the unique value proposition of the Water Court on its ritual and spellcasting side is that the Water Court's rituals natively allow you to prepare multiples of them. Now, that's really cool, but as effects, they are balanced around that, although one of them does generate water terrain, and that's really, really goddamn powerful. But the fact of the matter remains that they are built and balanced around having multiple rituals, and you just always have that 100% of the time for free for as long as the Maharaja's supremacy exists. And so there's just not going to be a use case for the Water Court, kind of in terms of the ritual space, for as long as the Maharaja exists as he is. It might mean that we see the Sorcerer emerge as a possible secondary warlord, because if you're going to run Court of Water, then I guess by definition you need the Maharaja a bit less, and we might see the Sorcerer's Supremacy, which I haven't even mentioned this video because it's so irrelevant at the moment. But it is kind of a weirdness that we will need to see, just to see how it resolves. Very much watch this space in the hopes that it lands somewhere solid. And I personally really hope that it does, because it's Water Court that is most interesting of the unreleased and in fact released models to me. I love all of the stuff that Water Court has going on. I love spellcasting on regiments. I love both the theme and the effect of all of the rules on all of the water stuff. I don't think they'll necessarily snap pick into the most powerful court if fire goes unaltered, because fire is just mechanically so powerful. The water court, particularly the points cost, restrain them from overtaking fire. But the mechanical tools that they have call to me very strongly if they don't see some changes. The dream for me would be that the Maharaja gets wound back just a little bit, that the rituals available to the Sorcerer Kings, we just don't have ways to get multiple rituals in play at all, except through the Water Court, and the Water Court is balanced accordingly. That's what I think we'd be looking at in terms of the ideal state. That does mean that the Maharaja's supremacy needs to be reworked, which I think is fine. And it's in that kind of an environment that I would expect to see the Water Court to come to rival the Fire Court, even if there are no other changes made in terms of amongst the best Sorcerer King's courts. Now, there is one final non-court regiment that we know is coming but isn't yet released, which is the Maharabati Sorcerer Saints. And so just as a placeholder for them as well, they are Cavalry Mahabharati, which means I believe they will be riding the elemental like the manifestations of the elemental that is bound to them, which means the model's probably going to be super cool. And they are a complicated regiment that nevertheless sits optimistically around the bottom of B. A little bit like the Mahabharati Sardar, their unique ability, elemental prowess, allows them to draw down ritual markers from a ritual to gain an effect. In this case, healing an elemental regiment within 12 inches of 4 wounds. They are an elemental regiment in addition to being Mahabharati, so they can heal themselves, which is really cool. If they draw down an extra 2, they also gain Blessed, and Blessed is a really good ability, even if you have to access it as a draw event. However, like the Mahabharati Sardar, that is just not an ability anyone will give a shit about for as long as the Maharaja supremacy continues to exist. Because just like the Sardar, as long as the Maharaja's supremacy exists, you always get full value from your ritual tokens. There are no surplus ritual tokens to remove. Which means elemental prowess just isn't appealing because it's giving up actual progress towards your most powerful mechanic, and until that changes, they won't have value out of that ability, which is a shame because otherwise they're very cool. They're a little bit fragile, but they're a lot less fragile when you consider that they can heal themselves for 4 wounds every round. And their damage output is very serviceable. 7 attacks per stand, with Clash 3, Cleave 1, and Terror 1 is just really neat, along with Movement 7. And Vanguard 3 making up for the fact that they're otherwise a heavy regiment. These guys are cool, and the models will probably be absolute bangers, but the very top end of the army needs a little bit of a tweak for them to be really considered appealing. Now, that wraps up this video. Hope very much that you've enjoyed this. If you did and would like to support the channel, you can do so either via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below, or by becoming a channel member on YouTube. I cover multiple wargames, Conquest is one of them, and I do take requests for video topics from my channel supporters. Otherwise, go ahead, click like and subscribe. All of that YouTube stuff, it does help the channel out. And we'll be back soon with more Conquest content, probably another tier list, probably Old Dominion, but I'm very willing to take requests from people as to what they would like to see most. Until then, hope very much that you've enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time.